I would like to introduce our panelists here today. We have Simon Enoch. He works out at the Saskatchewan office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming out today. This is an impressive turnout, and giving up your Saturday to listen to a policy discussion speaks well of all of you. You're all saints. I want to discuss, I guess, the elephant in the room that I think will haunt any subsequent policy discussions that we have today. And that's obviously the current economic health of the province and the government's financial situation. I think how we view the current economic situation will determine whether we believe we have choices going forward or whether we have to accept the government's narrative of deep and immediate cuts as inevitable. Okay? More? Okay. So I'd like to use my time this morning to challenge some of the economic assumptions that I think limit the horizon of what is possible, even in the current economic situation. And I certainly think that we can see these assumptions at work when we look at the scope of the transformational change undertaken by the government so far. I think it's pretty clear, and probably most of you would agree, that the Saskatchewan government's transformational change agenda has really been a clever euphemism for austerity. Everything that the government has done under the banner of transformational change in the past few months has been to cut, it's been to downsize, it's been to roll back, or it's been to eliminate. More often than not, these cuts have been directly at the expense of the province's most vulnerable people. So we think of the cuts from the last budget. We saw cuts to seniors and children's drug plans. We saw reduced funding for the alternative measures sentencing program. We saw reduced funding for the Aboriginal court worker program and clawbacks to some social assistance programs. Most recently, we've had the announcement of the government eliminating 251 custodial jobs, the lowest paid of most government employees, and now threats to eliminate even more with the suggestion that they will privatize all cleaning services in the province. So the government has been entirely focused on the cost side of the ledger, to the neglect of any revenue-generating ideas. Although I suspect we probably will see some tax increases in the next budget, but it will be a regressive across-the-board sales tax hike. So I don't think it's controversial to say the government views transformational change as an exercise in cost-cutting to the detriment of any other alternatives. Now, obviously, the justification for these cuts is the size of the provincial deficit and the government's insistence that we have to return to balance as quickly as possible. And if we're to believe the finance minister, we're supposed to be in surplus by 2018. Let me know if you think that's doable. But if we believe that these are the wrong choices to make and that there are alternatives that do not disproportionately burden the most vulnerable in our province, then we need to stop buying into the government's deficit hysteria. Because that only allows the government to justify cuts as the only means forward. Every time we decry the size of the deficit, or liken it to the divine era, we are, intentionally or not, playing into the government's frame, that it's the deficit that matters, not unemployment, not preserving social programs or the environment, or ensuring the most vulnerable in our province are taken care of. That's not to say that we can't criticize why we're in a deficit position, particularly after nearly a decade of booming commodity prices, but if we act as if the mere existence of a deficit is akin to the sky falling, then we are just painting ourselves into a corner when it comes to possible remedies. So I think we need to put the deficit in perspective, particularly in relation to our current debt levels, so we can better see what choices are available to us. Now, Saskatchewan's economy is much larger than it was in the 1980s or 1990s. So while $1 billion deficit in 1991 was cause for grave concern, I don't think it warrants the same alarm now. So let's look at comparisons. Divine-era debt reached over 40% as a percentage of GDP, and if you add Crown debt, it was closer to 60% of GDP. Saskatchewan's current debt as a percentage of GDP is only 19.9%. That's the second lowest in the country after Alberta. Compare this to Manitoba's 30.9%, or British Columbia's 26.6%, or Ontario's massive 40%. And Saskatchewan's debt burden is relatively low, leaving the option open for maintaining current spending levels or even enhancing them. The National Bank, in their analysis of the Saskatchewan's 2016 budget, had this to say: And I'm quoting, "Overall, the debt burden can be deemed low, second only to Alberta, with the interest bite very manageable, contingent liabilities fairly limited, liquidity very healthy, and budget flexibility and taxing room available should it be required." So we have room to maneuver, which means that we don't have to try and balance the budget immediately as the government insists, which means we don't have to accept massive cuts to public services and the public sector as an inevitability. Does that mean we don't have to worry about the deficit? Of course not. But we can choose how and when to deal with the deficit on grounds of our choosing and that are more favorable. Let me give you an example. How many of you remember Paul Martin's Hell or High Water budget, 1995? Yeah, most of you remember that. Okay. For those of you that didn't, Paul Martin, when he was finance minister in the Chrétien government, made probably the most dramatic cuts to health and social transfer in Canada's history in an effort to tackle the then deficit. That budget is a large part of how the federal government has managed to really extract itself as a full partner in funding health and social programs in the provinces. So these cuts still reverberate with us today. And like Saskatchewan today, Martin conducted his cuts during a recession, and the cuts had the effect of actually contracting the Canadian economy for a short period of time. But by 1997, Ottawa was back to surplus. So this is a success story, right? Well, not if you compare it to other industrialized countries that were also fighting deficits at the same time. In fact, 18 other countries balanced their budgets during that same period, slightly later than Canada, but balanced them nevertheless. And they did this by either maintaining spending or expanding spending. Well, how did they do this? Well, the economic conditions changed. The world economy recovered, and in a positive growth environment, it's a lot easier to balance budgets. More people are working, increasing tax receipts, and less are relying on social supports, so governments are bringing in more revenue while spending less. That makes fighting deficits a lot easier than in a recession when tax receipts are low and you're spending more on social supports. As economist Jim Stanford demonstrates, had the Chrétien government merely held the line on spending and merely waited for positive growth to return, the deficit could have been balanced by 1999, only 2 years later, and without any of the massive dislocations caused by such dramatic spending cuts. And I think it's important to note that for the most part, those cuts were never fully restored. And that's even after what we remember as year after year of surpluses. But this is what I mean by tackling the deficit on grounds of our choosing that are more favorable. It is much easier and far less painful to tackle deficits when you are in a positive growth environment. And we are not in a positive growth environment right now. But the second important thing to keep in mind is that implementing austerity during an economic downturn can actually hinder the return to positive growth. As I mentioned, the Martin cuts actually had the effect of briefly contracting the economy. The fact that austerity measures implemented during a downturn actually contract the economy is pretty much now the received wisdom amongst economists. Even the International Monetary Fund, once a champion of fiscal austerity, has been forced to admit this. Assessing 30 years of evidence, the IMF unequivocally concludes, and I'm quoting, "In economist jargon, fiscal consolidations, or austerity, are contractionary, not expansionary. This conclusion reverses earlier suggestions in the literature that cutting the budget deficit can spur growth in the short term." Moreover, the IMF demonstrates that adoption of austerity measures during an economic downturn is likely to lower incomes, hitting wage earners more than others, and raise unemployment, particularly long-term unemployment. Such effects have the consequence of exacerbating deficits as falling incomes diminish government tax receipts, while growing unemployment puts fiscal pressure on social supports like unemployment insurance, social assistance, retraining allowances, etc. Thus, attempts to try and tame deficits may have the perverse effect of increasing existing deficits, as prolonged economic stagnation taxes both government revenues and social spending. In light of this, the IMF advises governments to consider delaying deficit-fighting measures until a more robust economic recovery is evident. So if we want a good example of how austerity can backfire and produce the very thing that you're trying to avoid, we need only look at the United Kingdom over the past few years. So in response to the deficit racked up by bailing up the banks during the financial crisis, The Cameron government initiated an unprecedented series of austerity measures, cutting government spending across the board by 10% and eliminating 300,000 public sector jobs, with another 600,000 layoffs soon to come. Well, what was the result? Well, the British economy contracted 3 times. They fell into recession 3 times during those cuts. And debt levels actually went up, not down. When the Cameron government took power, debt in the UK was about 70% of GDP. Today it stands at 85% of GDP. The cuts did not work. They did the exact opposite. They contracted the economy and increased the debt burden. Now, I know that this may seem counterintuitive. How can cutting spending increase debt? The problem is that many governments want us to think about government finances the same way we think about household finances. So if I'm in debt, as long as my income stays constant and I cut my spending, I can pay down my debt. The problem is that the government is not a household, and we shouldn't think of it like one. Cuts in one area, say public sector jobs, increases costs in other areas, say social assistance or retraining allowances. Indeed, we've already seen this here in Saskatchewan. The government just announced that because there are more people accessing social assistance programs than expected, the government needs to spend an extra $55 million on that item. Moreover, if people lose their jobs or see their wages roll back, government's tax revenue shrinks, as people are much less likely to spend, thereby reducing the government's take of sales tax, and their incomes are reduced or eliminated entirely, and they're not paying income taxes. Once again, the government has seen a decrease of $400 million in expected tax receipts during this downturn. Same thing with other programs. If you cut alternative sentencing programs, more people end up in prison. Lo and behold, Saskatchewan has more people in correctional facilities than the government expected, creating the need for an extra $10.3 million for that line item. So this really creates a vicious cycle where you're trying to make cuts on one side to try and outdo the increased expenses you experience on the other side. The fact is that austerity just doesn't work. It produces the exact opposite of what austerity is supposed to achieve. Instead of reducing deficits and restoring positive growth, it induces contraction and increases debt. So the question must be asked, if austerity has proven to be so unsuccessful, why do governments pursue it? Well, according to Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, the primary purpose of austerity is to shrink the size of government spending to make the state leaner, not just now, but permanently. And as I mentioned before with the Paul Martin austerity budget, those cuts were never fully restored, even as the federal government posted surplus after surplus. So that shows you that those cuts weren't a temporary thing, they were a permanent thing. So I think we really need to be wary about this whole exercise of austerity because its effects are not temporary. They may very well limit what we can expect from the government far into the future. So as we talk today about the possibilities in Saskatchewan, I would ask you all to consider whether pursuing austerity will leave us with a government so stripped of its potential that we won't be able to realize many of the visions that people have for the future of this province that I hope to hear from all of you today. Thanks very much.